See. All right. Hello. Welcome to those who are joining us. We are going to wait just a couple minutes to let others get into the Zoom room before we start our webinar. I see several others coming in. We're so excited for our research spotlight today and to hear from our wonderful panelists. So we'll wait maybe just one more minute. Let's see. Yes, I do wish there was some way to get everyone candy for this, right?
Yeah, let's do that as a chat icebreaker. Put your favorite Halloween candy in the
I love
chat.
that. Yes.
Would love to know what people's favorite is. What's the one that you get and you're like, yes, I love those.
Gotta be
Oh, 100 grand. You don't see those very often,
No.
Sarah. That's a throwback. Twix, okay.
Mm,
Oh, I love York peppermint patties.
Especially frozen ones. Do you ever freeze those?
yes.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
Oh, the chat's disabled, it says, for webinars in our.
Oh, no, bummer.
Oops. Nice.
Well, now you know our favorite
Q&A.
candy.
Yeah.
All right. It is, let's see, we're a little bit past 11, so let's go ahead and get started. We are very excited to welcome you all to this research spotlight session this afternoon. Today, we are joined by Elizabeth Zagata, who is the Public Policy Chair for the Division for Learning Disabilities and the Council for Exceptional Children. We also have Sarah Papineay, who is a Special Services Instructional Coach at Eden Prairie Schools in Minnesota. And finally, we have Emily Hardeman, a doctoral student in special education at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, they will be talking about evidence-based literacy policies for pre-service and in-service teachers, a very important topic, one that is very timely, and we are so excited to hear from them today. Just a reminder before I turn it over to our wonderful panelists that if you do have questions that come up during the webinar, you can go ahead and use that Q&A function to put your questions into the chat, and we will pose those to our panelists at the end of the session. The way this is going to be structured today, we'll start with a presentation, some information from our panelists. I have some questions then that I'll be posing to them, and we'll end with any attendee questions that come up. All right, so let's go ahead. I'm going to kick it off to Sarah to get started. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thanks so much for having us. We all got together because Elizabeth is our policy chair and she reached out to the team. Both Emily and I serve on the policy committee as well, and decided to write a policy brief. And we all have some kind of hand in literacy or have been, focusing on literacy or been impacted in our state by literacy. So we started to talk about that and started just even recognizing within the three of us the variances between policies within states. So we just felt that it would be an important topic to explore a little bit further and put out as a brief. So in a sense, just we believe that effective literacy instruction does depend on a strong policy and also sustainable funding, which in turn would hopefully promote that teacher knowledge and ongoing professional learning. So that's kind of where we started. I think. Anything else to add, Elizabeth, Emily?
Nope, that sounds great.
No, on this slide too, if you're looking at it, you can see there's a QR code if you're interested. If you haven't read the brief yet, it's brief, and you're welcome to either use the QR code, or I don't know if you all have access to slides yet, but there's a link embedded as well. All right.
Okay, so our development, we created two matrices. One was for pre-service teachers, and this is the part that I'm going to cover. So we used the NCTQ review of state policy, and we chose this because they are sharing information that's specifically around the policies within the states. It's not about their interpretations, but about the policies themselves. And they provided the most in-depth look at pre-service teacher program requirements across the US. So that is why we chose this. And there's a focus on these, on whether the programs adequately cover the science of reading. We're missing SOR right there after that bullet point. But yes, whether they focus on SOR within their programs and pre-service teaching. So we created a 17-point scale to evaluate each state. And actually, the NCTQ was much more extensive. This review that they have, this overview of state policy in pre-service, was actually 41 points. But what we did was we narrowed this down so that it really looked at the things that we were interested in, which are really about items that directly align to teacher preparation. And we excluded items that were really related to curriculum adaptation or PD after teachers were certified, or state funding specifically. So what we looked at was all based on state laws and standards. It evaluated domains of reading knowledge and specifically aligned to science of reading. So we went through and looked at item by item the different aspects of SOR and whether the states aligned with those. We also looked if they required specialized knowledge relating to English language learners and students identified with disabilities. And then we also were interested in if there was a state review process of the syllabi included in education prep programs. And we also were interested in, are there experts involved in that syllabi process, or is it just broadly done? And then we also were interested in the renewal process. So we looked to see if states reviewed programs for continued integration of these standards, and as well as pass rates that were occurring when pre-service teachers were testing. Okay.
And so the connection then to that was the pre-service data that we looked at. We then also used NCTQ's review of state policies for in-service, specifically for in-service, we looked at both funding and whether they required specific literacy training for teachers that are already in practice. So while we used NCTQ, which highlighted both funding to sustain those literacy practices, we also, and that professional development, we also used Excel and Ed, which took the similar data points on the policies, but went a little bit further in ranking it through implementation. And then so we took those two data points and then aligned it with some, I don't want to say arbitrary numbers, but we quantified it so that we could actually look at those data points and kind of do some, well, I don't want to say alignment across states between pre-service and in-service policies that were out there. So I think that's all that we have for that, because the next slide is a little bit more, I think, intriguing as far as what did this all tell us. And so before we're going to give you just a minute though to look at this. Before we do that, we'll explain it. We, like I said, reported both pre-service and in-service scores for each state. So this table shows the state and then the pre-service score. And so that pre-service score was a 0 to 17 range, and the in-service was a 0 to 12 point range. So if you want to take a moment and look at that and just consider some noticings, we'll give you just a minute to do that. All right. It probably wasn't a minute. It always feels so much longer than it really is. But that being said, Emily, do you want to kick us off with a little bit of the highs and lows, or do you want me to do that?
Yeah, I can talk about, do you want me to talk about the highs and then you can take the lows?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, sorry. As you can see, we've highlighted the highs and lows so that they're easy to find, but you can see that Ohio and Utah scored the highest. So they had almost perfect scores because, as Sarah mentioned, the scale was 0 to 17. And so they both in pre-service hit the 16 mark. And then you can also see that there were other states that were fairly high, like Texas was 15, Virginia was 15. We have a number of 15s and 14s. So we did have a lot of states that scored fairly high on our scale.
And then as you can see, with the states that maybe ranked lower or lowest on this chart were Maine and Montana, both, relatively low on that ranking scale that we provided in both pre-service and in-service. So we're going to talk a little bit about our surprises in a minute, but we'll probably review, just so you know, Leah, we'll probably reflect back on this chart when we talk about some surprises that might, the viewers might want to look at again. So,
Yeah, that sounds great.
okay.
Okay, and we did touch on a little bit in the brief of some examples from other countries. This was a policy brief that was written for LDRP, which is Learning Disabilities Research and Practice, which is the Division for Learning Disabilities flagship journal, and it does have an international audience. So we wanted to give a nod to folks in other countries, and we do know that there are a lot of other countries that also, like here in the US, use policy to try to get at those issues around teacher preparation for reading instruction, including students with learning disabilities. Dyslexia being the most common, which probably isn't a surprise, because if we're talking about reading instruction in kids with disabilities, that's probably going to be that likely overlap. So just a couple quick examples. Pakistan for in-service, they passed a special law in 2022, the Dyslexia Special Measures Act, and that requires that all schools have special educators that have dyslexia training. And then another example would be New Zealand for pre-service. They do require all their candidates in initial teacher education courses to take approved dyslexia classes, and those classes have to be approved by a certain organization. So again, just a couple examples of what other countries are doing in this space. So Leah, I will turn it back to you. I think you have some questions for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, Emily, and Sarah. That was great to hear those initial findings and about the policy brief. So my first question that I had was whether any of the findings from this study surprised you, and why or why not that was.
I'll jump in and start talking about the pre-service if that's okay, Sarah. So we noticed some patterns of discrepancy between pre-service and in-service state requirements, and 10 states had more than 50% discrepancy, where the pre-service actually ranked higher than their in-service requirements by a significant amount, by at least 50%. 8 of the 10 states have stronger pre-service requirements than they do have in-service requirements, and that's an kind of interesting reflecting point. Only Nevada and New Mexico had stronger in-service requirements than they did pre-service requirements. And then, Sarah, do you want to talk about that last?
Yeah, so what we found surprising as well was in the in-service category, just something to consider for states and policymakers was that there were 5 states that had policies in place that did require training for in-service teachers, yet there were no policies in the funding area for those states. So we know that for professional development to, work in states and policies to work that and sustainability of that funding is important. So that was one of the things we thought might be curious to readers, as well as to consider where those states are at, maybe with their implementation of possibly putting some funding in to support districts as they are trying to implement this training.
Yeah, absolutely. That is surprising, especially with the pre-service versus the in-service policies. Is not something that I would have thought would have come from this. So, thank you so much for that. Another question that I have is, so in the article, you suggest that further examination of the impact of policy on student achievement is needed. Can you expand on that a bit? Do findings suggest that policy affects student achievement? If not, what are some potential barriers impacting its effectiveness?
Sarah, do you want to kick this off and then I can jump in on the teacher knowledge?
Yeah, sure. Well, we had talked a little bit about this in the sense of what does policy actually do with impact of student achievement, and really not a lot of research is out there, and possibly because many of these policies are relatively new, specifically to the in-service policies because of the movement. I know maybe the pre-service has been in there longer, but the in-service, we were seeing a lot more policies being developed specific to that lately because of the science of reading movement, I guess is what we would say. I don't know. So that being said, we're not quite sure of what the student outcomes would be, but we do know teacher professional development impacts teacher knowledge. And we also know that professional development, that there are studies out there that show the professional development does have a positive impact on student outcomes. So it's now just linking that to the policies that are in place. Did I cover that, Emily?
Yeah. Another point is that the teacher knowledge literature that exists doesn't really look much at student outcomes. And we know that really teacher knowledge doesn't get measured significantly once teachers move out of their pre-service training program. So we have limited insights into what teachers know. And then that trickles down to we have limited insights into the student outcomes related to teacher knowledge. So more of the future research on teacher knowledge should also measure the impact of that knowledge on student related outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's also like that black box, right, between teacher knowledge and outcomes, like what happens in the middle with teacher practices as well. So I think it's exciting, right? Like a lot of opportunities for some research to expand on this and looked at the relations among these variables. So very nice. All right, I have one last question for you all. So based on your findings, what key recommendation would you offer to policymakers, practitioners, and researchers for strengthening literacy policy and teacher training?
Yeah,
Sarah?
great. I can take this one, but before I do, a couple things to all the wonderful attendees. We are trying to be respectful of your time and keep this to a half hour, but we will have time for Q&A. I'm looking at the clock now. We've got about 10 minutes left, so would love to know any questions you have. I don't think you have access to the chat, but you do have access to the Q&A, so please feel free to put questions in there. And we would also love if you can probably use the Q&A for this, but this isn't technically a question. We'd love to know what's going on in your state. Were you surprised by the findings for your state, or how are you seeing these policies roll out, both pre-service and in-service? So feel free to use the Q&A for that too. But yeah, back to your great question, Leah, around key recommendations. I think our overall recommendation, which is not on this slide, is really to stay the course. You know, these policy rollouts and implementation take time. And I'll give an example that's not necessarily related to teacher training, but there was just an article, I think this week, related to curriculum adoption. So a lot of these science of reading policies at the state level also have requirements around districts adopting certain curriculums. Some states have more strict requirements around that than others. New York City Public Schools, one of, if not the largest district in the country, adopted a new reading program, I believe, last year. The crux of this article was their scores dipped, their reading scores dipped, and it was basically like Chicken Little, the sky is falling, this reading program doesn't work. But of course, anytime you have any kind of adoption, including curriculum, it takes time to roll out, right? I mean, for those of you who are teachers, the first year you're using a new program, it's like a wash. We never got through the whole year of content and curriculum, right? People didn't know what they were doing. So I personally was not surprised to see scores dip, although of course, you know, we don't ever want to see that. We want to always be supporting kids and hopefully improving their outcomes. So it's the same with all these policies. Like we really need to stay the course to see how these policies impact change over time. But other recommendations, um, we think it really helps if policymakers communicate with state education agencies or SEAs to understand what are they actually doing now and how can policies passed in state legislators support that work. I think some states do a better job of that at others. There's a really good communication channel between the State Department of Ed and the legislature. Other states, not so much. And they're passing laws that might even be redundant with what the department's already doing. And in some cases, maybe the department would find problematic for, lots of reasons. So we think that's a really important communication channel to keep open. We've already kind of touched on this, but when these policies are passed, it'd be really helpful if accountability metrics were built in so that it was like, kind of like when you apply for grant funding, right? You have to have an evaluator, but there's some thought around how are we going to evaluate the impact of these policies. If that's baked into the policy itself, that would be great. For researchers specifically, and I know there's some on this call, I think we need to think about the consistency in some of these knowledge measures, knowledge measures that Emily and Sarah talked about, really looking at the reliability and validity of these teacher knowledge assessments. So that's an area we think is would be great for further development. And then also communication and collaboration between researchers at institutes of higher education and policymakers, right? Policymakers do not have expertise in all areas, including teacher preparation, both at the pre-service and in-service level, including effective reading instruction. So this is where researchers can really lean in and help fill in those knowledge gaps for policymakers. And then the last is really looking at certification and training for teacher licensure. We know that in-service policies are becoming even more critical because there are so many different pathways people are taking to get into the classroom, including emergency licensure and certification, which, in some cases are, for lack of a way to describe it, a drive-by, 6-week course, and then you're thrown into a classroom. So those in-service policies are really going to need to be more robust for that. And Emily, I'm going to toss it to you and or Sarah, if you want to say anything about specifically what's going on in your home states of Texas and Minnesota regarding that issue.
Yeah, in Texas this year, we have seen 40 to 45%, somewhere in that range of teachers in classrooms are uncertified. So we know they have not gone the traditional route of going through a higher education program. So the pre-service aspect of this analysis doesn't even capture what's happening. And so we really do need to lean on in-service knowledge development to support these individuals so that they are effective teachers of literacy, because we know they're most likely not holding the key information that's required to support student learning.
Yeah, and similarly in Minnesota, we have a tiered license system. So ultimately, the first 2 tiers could be a person who's, and to your point, Elizabeth, they don't even have to go through a course yet in order to get into the classroom. It's obviously through a hiring process in the districts. I'm in a district, we don't just hire anyone, but we are hiring people that that might meet our need, and then in hope are ready to go back to school to explore special education specifically for special ed, I guess. So that being said, we've made it a pathway into coming into education, specifically into special education as well. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do as far as making sure those people are prepared and then want to stay in the work, because it's hard to come into that work without that background and then sustain it and all the things that come with going to school and learning how to do such an incredible but really hard job.
Absolutely. We did have a question come into the chat or into the Q&A, excuse me. So an attendee asked, so is it a problem when literacy instruction becomes political? In other words, some people might reflexively oppose something just because the other team proposed it, even if it is good practice. Do we see that in this area of policy?
Oh, how long do we have?
Not enough time.
I'm happy to take a stab at this one, but Emily and Sarah would love for you to jump in too. Yes, I do think that, reading instruction is political just by historical nature, right? The whole idea of the reading wars. And I do think that some of these policies, I think, have had some political overtones to them that some people have kind of pushed back on because one side is proposing them. One of the most biggest advocates for effective reading instruction, especially dyslexia at the federal level, is Senator Bill Cassidy, who's from Louisiana. He is a Republican. He is currently the chair of the Education Committee at the Senate that the committee at the Senate that oversees education. It's the HELP Committee. So I mean, he's very clearly aligned with one side. But if you do watch some of the congressional hearings, and I have, there does seem to be somewhat of a sense that special education in particular is a bipartisan issue. Maybe reading isn't so much in that bucket, but I do think there's this sense that we all want to support kids. I will say that reading policies in certain states have been very political, and maybe not so much with certain size, but with certain subpopulations. So an example is California, where a lot of the discourse around passing state level reading policies there has been, they've had a lot of voices weigh in, but especially the community that supports multilingual learners has been very vocal and strong there because they want to make sure that any policies passed address that population. I believe it's something like 40% of California students are multilingual learners. So it's a huge consideration. So New York State, which is my home state, I don't live there now, but that was my first teaching certification. It's been pretty political there too. And I believe teachers unions have been a big voice in those conversations. So certainly a lot of advocacy groups, but I will stop there and see if Emily and Sarah want to add anything.
My one thought is our previous comments about funding, when we talk about things getting political, there is sometimes a link between politics and funding of certain policies. So we want to see funding available so that teachers have access to training, both examining what's going on in pre-service, but offering training as professional development and funding for sustaining those things. So yeah, there can be some issues when that becomes political and it's not more focused on the actual outcomes, which is the way it should be focused.
Absolutely. All right. I think let's take a look. I think that was our last or only question in the Q&A. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. We really appreciated learning from you and your discussion around state evidence-based literacy policies. To our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. We do have another session coming up, a lunch and learn. Dr. Sean Dachik from the Iowa Reading Research Center and the University of Iowa, one of my colleagues, actually is going to be presenting on 5 tips to improve sentence writing of students with learning disabilities. So he's going to be talking about how to plan and deliver an intervention to improve the text writing and sentence structure of students with LD. So if you are interested in joining that session, there's a QR code that you can use to register. That's on November 11th, so just in less than 2 weeks, from 12 to 12:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thanks. I'm going to just say thank you one last time. Happy Halloween to everyone. Enjoy your 100 grands, peppermint patties, whatever else your favorite candy was. And we hope to see you for the next DLD informational session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.